Welcome back. You're watching this edition of Kivumbi 2017, our post-Supreme Court ruling analysis of the case and the political repercussions. Of course, it is back to the drawing board in terms of the presidential election after the Supreme Court ordered for fresh elections to be conducted by the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission. But before that, let's listen into some of the reactions to the ruling. Let's listen into the reactions by the National Super Alliance after winning this election petition.
What has transpired today is but the first step in ensuring electoral justice in Kenya.
A very historic day, not just for Kenya, but for the African continent. As an officer of this court, I feel that the dignity and the integrity of the Supreme Court has been reestablished.
I personally disagree with the ruling that has been made today. I disagree with it, and 6 people have decided that they will go against the will of the people.
Don't interfere. And don't think that because our friends shout and we keep quiet, that we are scared of you. No, we are not.
Na mimi nimeshangaa kwa sababu nafikiri Kenya ndio nchi ya kwanza duniani. Nchi ya kwanza ambao watu wachache ambao hawazidi 6 na kati yao 3 au 4 wameamua ya kwamba hawa ndio wana uwezo kushinda wananchi milioni 15. Watu 4 ati ndio watakuja waseme kulikuwa technicality, ati wananchi milioni 15 hawatarudia kura 6, watarudia kura 1. Sasa wewe jamani, hata ukiwa mjinga namna gani, jiulize. MC amepigiwa kura, imekuwa transmitted na huyo mtu mwenyewe ndio ametuma majaji kila kona, 47 counties, ati kushuhudia kuapishwa kwa magavana.
Visibly act President Uhuru Kenyatta there. Of course, we have said both sides of the political divide are back on the campaign trail. Mutinda, a lot of Kenyans have been talking about the reactions to this. Some of them sharing your view that, you know, it is all political banter, and it is his way of expressing dissatisfaction with that ruling by the Supreme Court. But is it fair to say these are just 6 Kenyans making a decision and not the 15 million Kenyans who voted? These are 6 judges of the highest court in the land, which has mandates of the people of Kenya, isn't it?
No, the question, it has a constitutional mandate, of course. The constitution was passed by Kenyans. But the question is that a logical question to ask? Is that a logical question? That's a debate that should be encouraged. There's nothing wrong with it. Because the question is, the sovereign will of the people has been expressed. There are issues about whether what result was given is what the people said. But the bottom line is that the sovereignty, all sovereign power in this country lies with the people. So it is a question of, you can imagine the number of people who went out to vote. And if you've listened to what happened, there was no issue with the people voting. There was no issue with the vote counting. There was no issue with the tallying. There was only issue with the transmission. And that if there was any mistakes that were done, they were probably done during transmission. So the question then probably that you need to ask yourself is, considering the aspect of the sovereign will of the people, was there any other way to establish what the people had said minus whatever might have happened during transmission? The thing is, would we have a choice to probably go back and establish what exactly did the people say, minus whatever other interferences that might have taken place during the transmission? Because there is a time that in this country we used to do these things manually, and we still used to have results that used to be respected. So those are questions about the magnitude, the seriousness to which we attach the issue of sovereignty. And I think that is simply what the president is trying to emphasize.
Fair enough.
And I think it's a debate that should be encouraged. I've told you there's a reason why these things have not happened in the world. And if you look at it, it is because of the weight. It is the weight of it is because of the weight placed on the issue of people directly expressing their sovereignty.
Fair enough, but is it fair for the president to call the Supreme Court judges wakora?
No, I have said, you see, he's expressing himself. You see, there's a difference. You know, action speaks louder than words. This is the president of Kenya. We've not heard anybody explaining about an incident where they've been intimidated beyond people expressing their dissatisfaction. So I think there's an attempt to, and I've told you, even previously, other leaders are known to have cast aspersions. There's one, the NASA leader is known to commonly refer to Mahakama as bandia when they don't. It's the same thing that the president is saying. It's just that they are human at the end of the day, irrespective of whatever positions they hold. They are humans, and at times they act humanly, so they express themselves. But the thing is there any law that the president has broken by just expressing his views on what happened?
Ben, let me explain something.
There's something that he said about that we will deal with them when we
I want to explain that.
I will deal with them.
Thank you very much.
He represents the executive arm of government.
Let me first say this.
He's threatening the judiciary.
Let me say this, that the Constitution, there is no one who is divine in the constitutional framework of Kenya. And that is why in the same Constitution, there are safeguards and there are even ways of getting people out of office in case they are in violation of anything. We do not know what the president says. The president has a lot of intelligence. We know of an immediate former Supreme Court judge who had been accused of having been bribed with 200 million to rule in a certain way in an election petition. That is enough evidence that these people are very human. The president has not given details about what he knows, but if there is anything that falls within the threshold of Article 168 of the Constitution, which is what guides us on the removal of judges, then the president is within his right to say what he is saying. And he has not gone further than that. So why is it that we want to insulate people as if they are divine public officers? There is no one who is divine. These people are human, and for as long as we have a basis to question what they have done, then we are within our right to do so. That is why, supposing we had gone with the same argument, what would have happened to Tonui and the petition thing? And yet we saw what happened. It's unfortunate that the matter was not concluded. But the fact that there was such an allegation tells you that these people are as human as all of us.
Fair enough.
So let the president be given his time. Once we are through with the election, if there is any evidence, we will follow the Constitution to do whatever we will.
Hesbon, what is your take?
I think the issue here is very simple, that when Kenyans went to express their sovereign will, the manifestation of that will was in numbers. And you need to ask yourself, when the judges made their ruling, was it just a question of numbers? So it was not a question of numbers, because if these numbers are manufactured in a manner that does not reflect the sovereign will, then every other person is likely to question those numbers. And in this case, NASA went to court, and the court gave a ruling. And there's nothing we can do about that. Now, if we have the presidency as a symbol of unity, then there are a few things that come into mind. You know, one scholar that I really respect, who founded one of the, biggest communication university in the region, once said that communication that is made in public, increases the commitment of the communicator to whatever they are communicating. And this is Donald Smith. And you see, the moment you have a symbol of national unity express a certain mode of thinking in public, we get the impression that he has a commitment to do what he's saying. And I just want to believe that whatever he's saying will be done in accordance to the law, the way Kavemba is saying, Article 168. But from a communication expert point of view, at this time, there are people who are happy, there are people who are grieving, there are people who are indifferent, and all these people are Kenyans, and they mean well for this country. So it is incumbent upon the leadership of this country to also realize that because of all this, they have a responsibility, you know, to act in accordance to the greater good of this country. And I'll remind the communicators and the key political leaders today that there are two key principles in communication. One, communication is irreversible. So the statements that you're making out of emotion, you cannot take them back. And even if you take them back, the impact will already be outside there. And then secondly, communication is inescapable. So you afford yourself a platform where you're going to respond emotionally, then it's going to be very dangerous. And because you're going to an election, it is also critical to make statements that will make the whole process of electing another president or in the case of Jubilee, confirming that Uhuru actually won, less emotive. And it is important that we stick to the rule of law and not hoodwink Kenyans on things that never happened, even as we wait for the comprehensive ruling.
All right. Mheshimiwa, what do you think about the utterances by the president?
Well, firstly, Ben, you know, the beauty of becoming a member of parliament is that you have etiquette that does not allow you to jump into a conversation, even when you have a desire to do so. But let me begin by saying Article 28 of the Kenya's Constitution says that every citizen has a right to dignity, and that dignity must be protected and preserved. Even if Maraga wasn't a Supreme Court judge, he still deserves that dignity as is provided in law. Now, why Kenyans went into the ballot in 2010 to change their constitution? Because there were so many excesses that were expressed by the executive that had to be checked. That is why we created Article 4, not Article 4, but Chapter 4 of the Kenya's Constitution that talks about Bill of Rights. That particular chapter is anchored in all the chapters of the Kenya's Constitution because those excesses had brought about real suffering to the Kenyan people in one way or another, directly or indirectly. Now, judges, based on evidence, litigated a matter and arrived at a decision that I believe is well reasoned. And as we await for the final verdict to be rendered, we will see how they managed to arrive at that.
All right.
Now, the president, who should actually help in protection of that dignity, goes out to profile judges and even call them names. Even if Justice Maraga did not have to make a ruling of that magnitude, the mere fact that firstly we are Africans, and in the contemporary African society, we must have respect to our elders. Maraga is way above President Uhuru Kenyatta in terms of age. And the African context, you must respect the elderly. Even if Maraga wasn't the judge of the Supreme Court, he still deserves that respect that is not just in law, but is also within our African living standards. And that brings into question some of our upbringing. But most fundamentally, President Kenyatta was given a fair hearing, as is espoused in Article 50 of the Kenya's Constitution, because you don't condemn somebody unheard. And he was given that mandate. He had a litany of lawyers in that court. In fact, topmost lawyers. If you were to look at the profiles of these lawyers, they were much better than lawyers from the NASA side. But what helped NASA's case is because they had evidence. Even if you go to a court of law and you only are armed with evidence, you can still choose not to talk and let them decide on the degree of evidence that you provide. But we were still given time to submit. His party was given time to submit and provide rebuttal evidence, which they couldn't find. So I think that it was very unfortunate that the president has gone headlong to profile judges, call them names, and you know, it doesn't portend well for the peace of this country. But even if the profiling had to be done along, as I've heard, along tribal lines, as they would want us to believe, Justice Ojwang comes from the same tribal grouping as Raila Odinga. And he refused to support Raila Odinga's case in court. Now, even if that is anything to go by, then we should blame Njoki, because Njoki could not abandon her community to come to our side so that they express what Ojwang did. And therefore, we see a very well-balanced judicial undertaking. So I think it is wrong.
All right.
As a nation, we have to move forward. We have elections coming up in a few days. And, you know, my brother here has alluded to the fact that they hit the ground running on the spot. In fact, the exact day the judgment was made, they were on the ground running. What does that tell you? That they never won. So what they are doing now is to try to consolidate certain areas so that as the time comes, when somebody has won fairly, you take your time like we did. You relax. You go back to the drawing board. You know, you discharge the next course of action. Then you hit the ground running. So that was a testament that Jubilee lost elections and lost in the Supreme Court.
No, I want to correct something. That was a testament that they're in agreement with the ruling. Yes, that was a testament that they're in agreement with the ruling. As they are respecting the ruling. As much as they are differing with it, they are respecting it. And that is why they started acting in compliance immediately, so that it does not leave any doubt. You can imagine if they'd not done that and already people are starting to doubt their commitment to whatever judgment. The way they've acted, and I've said again, action speaks louder than words. The people we need to question, whatever intention they might be having, is NASA. Fortunately, today they have a rally. I'm waiting to hear whatever pronouncements they are going to make. Because instead of starting to campaign, they've started challenging whether IBC should be the ones to oversee the next election or not. So clearly, the Jubilee is focused on a fresh election. NASA has got other issues. We hope that will come out clearly in their rally today.
We'll talk about that. Dismas, let's talk about President Uhuru Kenyatta, profiling, as Jared put it, the judges of the Supreme Court. Would he have done it if the case had gone his way?
Well, if the Supreme Court had rendered a ruling in his favor, then we'll be having the swearing in the next few days. Yeah. He would be a very happy man. He would have said that the Supreme Court in Kenya is very solid, very good judges, beyond reproach, like Caesar's wife. He wouldn't be doing this kind of profiling, which I find to be unfortunate, because when you're appointed to become a judge of the Supreme Court, as I indicated earlier on, you don't crawl from the woodwork. You go through the vetting at the National Assembly. And at the National Assembly, President Kenyatta had a majority in the last parliament, as he does in these other parliaments. So he had the opportunity, if he suspected, if he smelt a rat among the 3 new judges, to stop them. And in any event, he's the one who appointed the justice and the chief justice and the deputy. He had a very unique opportunity to stop any mischief. Now, when you go to the Judicial Service Commission, the president is represented by the Attorney General. So he had the opportunity to influence the entire decision-making process. And if one must attack the Supreme Court, which people are invited to, attack the decisions. Do not attack the personalities. You are supposed to attack the decisions till the cows come home. It happens in the US, it happens in the UK, wherever there's a ruling. Even in the magistrate's court in Kibera or Makadara, if a ruling you don't like, you can go ahead, attack it vigorously, but spare the personalities, so that we grow jurisprudence. Because when you say there are those 6 people in derogatory manner, then what do people make of the Supreme Court? Next time you've got a matter with a traffic officer and you're taken to Kibera or Makadara, you will treat a magistrate with a similar contempt, saying the best practice has been set. And when you look at the Supreme Court ruling critically, and I take departure from Honorable Okello, he's a member of parliament. I know he's not going to jump in. But it's not a win for NASA. It's not a loss for Jubilee. But it's a win for democracy and for our institutions. We now know for a fact that Kenya has got very strong institutions. What we lack are strong personalities to run those institutions. So that even if you're looking at IBC as we go for election in the next 60 days, asking ourselves, are we going to disband it? Are we going to restructure it? Of course, when NASA says they want to disband IBC, it's not possible. If you disband IBC, you will need a substantive president of the Republic of Kenya to sign that into law. And I doubt whether President Kenyatta today has got that mandate. In that case, what options are we looking at? Should we get technical support or expertise to make sure that IBC is going to deliver this election? Or are we going to be in a place where we can say we can get the international bodies, like say the UN, the European Union, to come and assist us on critical areas? Because still at the end of the day, it's IBC which is going to run this election. If we start tiptoeing around this issue, we'll be losing out. But Ben, looking at the bigger picture, and maybe this is to address what Jubilee has been saying, because Jubilee has been saying it's unlikely that the the vote is anchored on the fact that we've got a majority in all other elective positions, the other 5 elections. But using a very good example, like say in Langata, Jubilee had 1 candidate, and then NASA had multiple candidates. So even when you look at basic maths, it means that there's a very high probability that Raila got more votes in Langata than President Kenyatta. Because, for instance, the person who became MP in Langata, Honorable Nixon Korir, he bet his competition by just about 1,000 votes. That was the ODM candidate. But if you add the votes of Wiper, Ford Kenya, and everything else, it comes on top of that. And number 2, and probably most important, the only election petition which has been determined in Kenya today is the presidential one. And I suspect in the next couple of weeks, lawyers are going to be flooded with petitions so that people will question for the gubernatorial races, how are they conducted? And I even suspect Honorable Kelo may get a challenge from the guy who got 180 votes. So there are going to be so many petitions. It's still very early for anybody to start opening the champagne bottles.
Let's talk about that. Do you think, Mutinda, let me start with you. Do you think we're going to see people in other elected positions, losers, coming out using this as a precedent to challenge or to lodge petitions? What do you think is going to happen?
Yes, of course, that is expected. And, you know, some of them are not even very sure whether they were ready to go to petition their cases or not. But after this, I've personally met a few who have actually made up their mind after this ruling. So I have evidence that it is going to happen. Considering the number of people I've spoken to who initially were not thinking of doing it and who are going to do it because of this, it's going to invite a lot of petitions, more than if the ruling had been otherwise. Yeah, that I have to say.
All right.
Yeah, it's clearly going to impact on the number of their people whose sole motivation for petitioning will be that ruling. Before that, they probably had no concrete evidence to petition. But now that the Supreme Court seems to have set a precedent that qualitative issues can be used to nullify an election, I believe we are going to be seeing so many of them going to court.
And Ben, let's look at the risk here. If the Supreme Court ruling is going to be used solidly, because again, Honorable Kela has indicated that the 2013 one, nobody bothered to quote it anywhere. So assuming the 2017 is going to be quoted somewhere, there's a risk that Jubilee could lose its majority in the Council of Governors, in the National Assembly, in the Senate.
You need to repeat that.
And, well, this is objective analysis. This is not an answer position. But now, Ben, the germane question is...
It's a super majority.
Yeah, but the germane question is, if the numbers were fictitious, if the judges of the High Court decide to look at the qualitative aspect, and I'm just trying to draw a scenario. What if Jubilee loses the majority at the National Assembly and the Senate? What happens to the elected senators? Sorry, to the speakers of the 2 houses? Those will be now very interesting scenarios that will still require the same judiciary, which is getting a bashing from Jubilee, to come and give an opinion. So I see for the next 5 years, we are going to have very interesting pieces of legislation coming up, very interesting petitions. But more important, after 60 days when we have an election, whether it's President Kenyatta or whether it's Raila Odinga who wins, there's now going to be a very good case for a judicial commission to be established to study this 2017 election, so that we can understand, number one, what gives some IBC commissioners and managers the energy or the guts to disobey the Supreme Court. We need to establish that. And this issue of servers, we need to understand how come that we are being told by the defense lawyer that a server is 8 hours away, so you cannot access it. That it's in Europe, people are still asleep, you cannot access the server. So we need to get this information so that when we go for the elections in 2022, when IBC declares, say, Esbon Owila a loser, Wheeler can immediately come up with a concession speech and say this is solid. Because right now people have been telling folks, accept and move on.
Right.
But how do you give a concession speech if you do not know whether or not you lost?
All right. Hezbon, even as you make your points, let me ask you this. In 2007, when there was a disputed, a bungled presidential election, retired President Mwai Kibaki did not have members in the National Assembly. Uhuru Kenyatta's re-election has been invalidated by the highest court in the land, but he has supermajority in the National Assembly, in the Senate, in the Council of Governors. What is the likelihood, even as we see petitions flooding the High Court and all that, what is the likelihood that there could be more than meets the eye there?
Well, I think there's the likelihood that probably with the precedence that has been set by this ruling, that a few things will change. But even if Jubilee maintains the supermajority in the Senate and the National Assembly and, a higher number of governors in the Council of Governors, I think for me, if you look at it from a very objective point of view, it doesn't mean that if the next general election gets Jubilee out of power, that Kenyans would be worse off. Actually, it means that when we have the presidency held by a totally different wing of the government and parliament dominated by a totally different side of the ruling, divide, that is even good for Kenyans, But coming back to the number of petitions that are going to follow up on this ruling, it's not accurate to say that the 2013 ruling was not cited. I think it was cited enough times here in Kenya, at least 4 times that I remember. And one of the key people who benefited from that precedence was the Migori governor, whose win was challenged by Professor Yugi, was an ODM candidate then. And I think they used the threshold that was set to secure his position as somebody who had won. But most importantly, it is also important to understand that I think the judges in Kenya are actually going to be alive to the fact that there is a ruling that was made in 2013, and then there is the 2017 ruling. So it is not all out there that the 2017 ruling is going to work for the losers. But then it is a little bit more of a head start for most of them, because all you have to do in any petition is just to prove that beyond the numbers, there were irregularities, and then there were illegalities. So if you can prove that there were irregularities and illegalities, you stand like 60% a chance to have a petition, go in your favor. So we will see a number of those, but we cannot just say that it is going to be as easy as the precedence that has been set.
All right.
Well, Ben, it is true that most losers now are buoyed by that decision, and for various reasons. One is that the decision of a Supreme Court is binding on all lower courts. So if you were to rely on that authority for whatever reason, and you can back it up with some evidence, that election will be nullified. So we do expect that several by-elections will be carried out going forward. But again, a court of law...
Are you under any threat by the Jubilee candidates?
Well, I wish I were. I wish I were. I would only prove again the 61,301 against 180. But I'm not.
Okay.
Unfortunately. So cases are also decided on their own merit, so that you don't just rely on the authority from the Supreme Court and connect it with your case, even when there is no connecting factor at all. So still, the responsibility rests with the petitioners to present evidence that will be sufficient enough to void an election.
All right.
Another thing that I would want to mention about IBC, it was not the finding of NASA coalition that IBC was involved in transgressions in the electoral process. That was the finding of the Supreme Court. So what NASA is only doing is to add more weight on that particular deliberations, that if you have been found culpable of meddling with an electoral process, how sure are we that if we go to another round of election with this kind of composition, that all shall be well? Those are our fears, and they are not unfounded fears. Every Kenyan will be at pains to accept another Chiloba, who was actually given a very stern warning 4 days to the election by none other than our deputy president elect, in quotes, Honorable Stephen Kalonzo Musyoka. He said, Chiloba, listen, if you mess up this election, you will be cast forever. And it has already begun. When a Supreme Court finds such culpability of an individual, that's a curse in itself.
We'll talk about that next. Yes, this one.
Allow me to buttress a point around the statement issued by Chebukati. Chebukati admitted that they've been at the commission for less than 7 days, and they found a function, 7 months, They found a functional secretariat. He now suspects that a number of those staffers are criminals. So I'm wondering Did he get this revelation after the Supreme Court's ruling that a number of his staffers could be criminals, that he's now inviting Keriako Tobiko? And maybe the curious question is, has now Keriako Tobiko taken the offer? Has he responded to the invitation? And is he doing investigations? Because the larger picture is, when you engage in this kind of mischief, as established by the Supreme Court, are we going to let people go away with murder, or is somebody going to take responsibility? Because it's going to cost the taxpayer a lot of money to go for another presidential election, and there's so many by-election because of errors of commissions by individual personalities.
Hold on to that thought. That is what we want to discuss next. Many thanks for staying with us here on the broadcast. We take a quick commercial break. When we return, we focus our attention on the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission under massive pressure and internal purge from both sides of the political divide, which means that the electoral body is set for a rough next few weeks, even as it prepares to hold another presidential election. We'll talk about that, even as both sides of the political divide go to the campaign trail in preparation for that election in less than 60 days' time. We'll also try to answer some of the questions that have been asked. What will this mean? Is this like, August 8th never happened? Is it going to involve all the presidential candidates that were there on the 8th of August? We'll be giving you the details.